Okay. Hi. Welcome, everybody. This is Kelly Thompson. Oh, we are live right now.
We're
There's a
live.
button that actually tells us we're live. So the button just went off. And so, hello. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Kelly Thompson of There's Nothing Wrong with You, and There Never Was. And I'm here with Shavaun Scott of the Substack. What's the name of your Substack, Shavaun?
Spotlight on Psychology, I believe.
That's right. Spotlight on Psychology. And we're going to talk about her book, Nightbird, um, which is a memoir. And it's absolutely incredible. So I'm really happy and excited to be here with Shavaun. This is my first live video stream, and it's also Shavaun's, I believe. And even though she has more experience doing podcasts and things like that. But anyway, so we're all here together. And I just love seeing that people are, wow, we have a lot of people already. This is
Yeah, the names
fantastic.
pop up.
So I'd love for people to put questions in the chat. We also will put resources in the chat and we'll put links in the chat. So we'll put like um, a link to get the book. We will also put resources. Okay. So I guess I'll start with an introduction of Shavaun. So Shavaun Scott is a licensed psychotherapist, author, and speaker. She has over 30 years of experience in the field of mental health. And she specializes in trauma recovery, the treatment of anxiety and depression, and the exploration of the psychological aspects of violence and criminal behavior. And she's a passionate advocate for mental health education, frequently lecturing and writing on topics related to emotional wellness, trauma, and the societal impact of violent crime. And her writing is incredible. Let me just say that. Her writing is so beautiful. This is an intense book with deep topics. And I want to say that reading it as a reader was a joy. It carried me through. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how Siobhan accomplished that in her writing because it's just an amazing thing. Um, she writes articles, essays, and books that explore complex mental health issues and offers insights into ways individuals can overcome society. She's written some wild stuff. The Forgotten Survivors of Gun Violence, Wounded, the Mind. Well, this is what I was really referring to, the minds of mass killers, understanding and interrupting the pathway to violence, and game addiction, the experience and the effects. So, Siobhan, hi.
Hi. And I'm
We
honored. Thank you so much. And you are very, very kind. Very kind. I appreciate it.
we connected on social media. It's probably been what, 10 years at
At
least.
least. Yeah.
And we've just had these resonances and this connection across the Wi-Fi, whatever it is, whatever this is in the
The
universe.
virtual world. Yeah.
This, yeah, the virtual world. And we just really connected in on so many levels, which will unfold as we talk about the book. So I'm going to start with a content warning. Um, Nightbird offers a rare and deeply human look at the intersections between religious conditioning. These are hidden intersections between religious conditioning, mental health, domestic violence, and a phenomenon known as revenge suicide. And if you're from a high control religious group, this live stream will be especially meaningful to you, as well as to those who are survivors of domestic violence or violence, family violence of any kind. Okay. This is really going to be relevant for you. We'll talk about how, the impact of rigid religiosity on mental health and trauma vulnerability. It's just an amazing book. It covers many themes. And subscribers, please, everybody who's listening, I don't want to call you subscribers, people, everybody who's listening, please put your questions and your comments in the chat. We'll do the best we can, but we're going to save questions until the end, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So do know that Nightbird includes themes of childhood trauma, intimate partner abuse, and suicide. Okay, as well as religious indoctrination. So take care of yourself. in choosing to attend or participate in this conversation. Your well-being is always the priority. So glad you're here. So I want to start out, Shavaun, with the epigraph. If we could, yeah, that's right. We're right on in order. The epigraph in the front of the book, and you'll notice that there's a picture of a guy in the background here in my office. Can you see it? It's
Yes.
Jung. It's Jung.
Oh,
He
yes,
has
it
a
is.
place. He has a place of honor in my office. I love you. So the epigraph that she has in the front of the book is one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And then the next line that we often don't hear is the latter procedure, making the darkness conscious, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular.
Mhm.
So, and this book takes us on a journey into the dark in a very illuminated, uplifting way. So
Thank you.
I
That was
love
the
it.
goal. Yes. I was afraid it would be too dark for people, but I haven't gotten that feedback yet because we do want it to all lead to wisdom.
Right. As it does. The other thing is the symbolism of the owl, the title Nightbird, and the symbolism of the owl. And there's a beautiful video. I forget what they call those teasers,
Yeah. Yeah.
trailers. There's a
Mhm.
beautiful trailer about this that I've shared that's so gorgeous, but so is the cover and that nightbird, that owl. So I wanted to hear about the symbolism of the owl.
Owls have always been sort of my creatures. Every home I've lived in, which is quite a few over the years, I've had trees around with owls of various sorts in them. And so I grew up listening to owls at night. And still, where I live in a rural part of Portland, surrounded by trees, we've got owls nesting in our trees. And so they've always just sort of been this looming presence. And looking up the mythology around owls, they were looked at in many cultures as harbingers of death. And there's certainly been a lot of death in my life, but also, of course, the bearers of wisdom. And so when I was writing
Mm.
this memoir, and I didn't know what I was going to title it, I just could not come up with anything. And one night somebody had told me, "Oh, did you hear that Stevie Nicks is on concert tour again?" And I thought, well, isn't that cool? She's in her 70s now. So I looked up video footage one evening, and there she was singing about the Nightbird and
Oh,
and
yeah.
that and then I looked up what were those lyrics about, and it was about death. And so I just immediately latched on. There's the owl, and there's the name of the book. So I sent it to the publisher, and he loved it because I hadn't been able to come up with anything. So that's how it happened, and I'm still listening to the owls. So
Yeah. Yeah, I see in your story, like, they've really been a companion to you all along.
mhm, mhm,
That's really fascinating to me how they've appeared at the different places that you've lived.
mhm.
The barred owls and the screech owls, and
Yeah,
then now in Portland, the owls, and
yeah,
that's really amazing.
yeah, yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention about the owl is that, you know how form can imitate content in a book, and that's always such a magical thing when
Mhm.
form imitates content, and the whole structure of this and the whole thing. It literally felt like an owl. It felt like a nightbird and owl carried me through this book.
Wow,
When
wow.
I got to the end, it was like I landed, like the owl landed with me on its back. It was like it carried me through the book.
That's amazing. Very
Um,
cool.
So it's in there. It's in between the lines, and it is awesome. So I really, really, I opened the book and I read the first line. My hometown smelled like exhaust and chorizo
Mhm.
or chorizo. I'm
You
not good
got
at
it. Yeah.
pronouncing. and and I was just entranced and drawn into that prologue and that first opening, the opening of the book. And one of the reasons is because guess what? I moved to the Inland Empire.
Oh,
to
that's where
teach.
I'm from.
Exactly. And that's where I moved to teach high school when I was 39.
So you know
And
what it smells like.
I left Colorado for the first time and moved to Southern California in the Inland
I
Empire.
did not realize, I knew we had a lot in common. I did not realize you spent time in the lovely Inland Empire.
Yeah, so when I opened this in this opening, I was, I not only was I there, and I'm sure other readers will be there because of the beautiful description and scene and everything that you draw, but I was, it was so familiar to me. I was like, oh my God. So I would love for you to share your voice with us and read the prologue for
Okay.
everyone
All right.
as an opening. Okay.
And I think I was trying to remember, where did I write this at? I think it was actually in a poetry class that I took here in Portland. And so that was sort of what was in my head when I wrote it.
Well, it's
Uh,
very lyrical, very poetic. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, prologue. My hometown smelled like exhaust and chorizo. The steel mill and freight trains belched black smoke into the sky. The dark gray air burned my eyes, leaving them permanently shot with crimson. If you tried to run, your chest hurt when you inhaled. Breathing was dangerous. People spoke Spanglish or hillbilly pidgin. Mariachis blew trumpets at weddings and quinceañeras. Everybody got drunk at funerals, and on weekends, swill Bacardi from the bottle in the back of cruising lowriders. Girls who got raped after football games already knew how much money they'd get from welfare if they decided to keep the baby. It was best not to cooperate with the DA, since every criminal had at least one cousin who did hits, and they'd get back at you if you snitched. I was a permanent alien in my hometown. All I ever wanted was to run away. But there were churches. Hallelujah, baptized and born again. Churches with rock bands on Saturday nights. Churches that were shimmering, warm, and bright, where the light was clean and holy, where God's family opened their arms to hug you, and they said they loved you, and everybody read the rules together from the same book. You could be baptized in the Spirit and speak in tongues, get filled with the Holy Ghost, and punctuate every sentence with, "Praise the Lord," and trust that good things will come to those who wait. In church, I learned that there was no need to think about the future. Just follow the blood on the tracks and trust God, who controls all things, even the temperature of the water that comes out of the tap. God, who numbers every hair on my head. God will take care of my life. No planning required, no thought required. Just pray. Don't feel, don't think, just pray. Keep praying. Keep praying. Pray harder. Pray until you're out of breath.
Wow. Yeah.
You remember.
Ah, it's such a beautiful opening. And there's so many layers and levels of meaning that are pray until you're out of breath.
Mm-hmm,
And that's what we were taught.
mm-hmm.
You
No
know,
thinking. You don't have to think.
yeah. For
Mm-hmm,
those who don't know, I was born and raised in a extreme fundamentalist cult known as the Two by Twos. There was a documentary done on them on Hulu called Secrets of the Two by Two Church. I wrote about it on Memoir Land as well. So there's some real commonalities that I share with Shavaun with the religion and the religiosity, and so many pieces came together for me through this book. Because maybe I'll get into that a little bit later, but we think, okay, this is about a revenge suicide, but it's not really about him.
mm-mm,
Let's not about him.
mm-hmm,
So it's about so much more than that.
mm-hmm.
And it's about what underlies our vulnerability to such
Exactly.
people, to
Yeah.
such people. Yeah. So we'll get into that too. Um, I wanted to talk, about the structure briefly, start because what you did here is you started with an inciting incident, and then you flashed back to your childhood,
Mm-hmm.
You actually start with the prologue, but then we go into the inciting incident,
Hmm.
and then back to childhood. And it's, of course, it's gripping, the first part. And there's so, the trauma, the way that you portrayed trauma is just so visceral, so visceral, and so real. The impact that such a terrible event would have, to find your partner, who's hanged themselves
Yeah.
basically, and the trauma that brought. But I think about the way that you were able to write about that, and also about the structure and how you use specific dates. How did the structure come to you?
It was really interesting. I had been in memoir groups for about 8 years, and I'm still in a couple. And I had a notebook, like about yay thick with different pieces that I'd written. And everybody always said, "Oh, are you going to turn it into a book?" And I would look at it and just go, I can't see any way to structure this. And so I put it down and gave up the idea of writing a book. And then on Facebook, a guy that runs a small press wrote me and he said, "I really like your dark sense of humor. Have you ever thought about writing a memoir?" And he really knew nothing about me other than my funny, dark Facebook posts.
Yeah.
And I said, I looked at my notebook. I go, "Yeah, I've thought about it." And so after many years of not looking at it and going through it, because I had given up on the idea, right? I picked it up and I started flipping through it. And it's like the structure just came to me. It's like it sort of just had to simmer for a while. And
Hmm.
then I picked out the pieces that I thought were relevant to the theme of my life. And it literally just fell together. And I think sometimes that's just the unconscious. We have to let things simmer for a while, and then it sort of created itself.
Yeah, I think that's really true as writers. I know it is for me that I try to, I'm struggling and struggling and I'm making all this effort, but in reality it's kind of writing me
Yeah.
subconsciously. And I don't even know that. And
Yeah.
but you can tell when something just comes together, that it's been on the burner for a long time.
Yeah, I
And
didn't have any editors involved. I at a couple points in the course of all the, creating all of it, I had sent emails to a couple people who did developmental editing, and it was really clear right up front I could not afford it. And so I just let go of that. So really, this is unedited. I did have a few writer friends read it, and the feedback I would get is, "Well, you need to say more about this because you didn't quite explain enough." So I would go write a few more paragraphs and explain some things more. But yeah, this is all out of my head.
well, I really admire it. It's got all these like pretty short chapters,
Hmm.
or almost vignettes, but they're
Yeah.
more than vignette. They're kind of like chapters, but they're short. And
Yeah.
then we've got six parts, and we start, with the prologue. We have the inciting incident, and then we circle back when we get to part five.
Right.
Um, so, and then
Close.
part six,
Close.
and the epilogue is just brilliant. So anyway, we don't want to do spoilers completely, and there will be some, but so. But tell me about writing trauma though. How did you protect yourself? How were you able to revisit this in writing? There's a lot of trauma here.
Yeah, tons of trauma. It really was not hard, interestingly enough, because I don't think any of it has ever left me. It's never left my body. It's always in the process of being worked out and worked through and understood from different lenses. Um, but that was just coming into memoir classes. And the way that happened, I moved to Oregon and I didn't know hardly any people. I had one friend here, but I didn't have a community. And somebody said, "Oh, there's this great place called Multnomah Arts Center that has all these art and writing and different kinds of classes you could go, and that would be a way to get to know the community." So I looked in the catalog and there was a memoir class, and that was the only thing that fit into my work schedule. So I signed up for that, and I'd never done that kind of writing before. And the teacher immediately puts you in scenes, and you go toward the hard stuff, not away from the hard stuff, and then re-experience the scenes viscerally. So that's really what started my big
Hmm.
notebook, was just being in groups where it was like, we're going to write about death today, put yourself in a scene. Well, that was easy, because there have been so many deaths in my life. So it was just something. I think I was at an age, I was in my late 50s when I started that process. I was just ready to tell the story. So I think it actually felt healing to be able to connect the dots. And even though I've had therapy over the years many, many times, and I've had some wonderful therapists, it never connected the dots for me the way that
Hmm.
this writing process did, where I really saw intergenerational patterns, and I saw my own patterns, and I saw the missteps, and I understood why there were those missteps, and grew to have more compassion for my parents, and the legacy of abuse in the family. I had lived with a lot of anger at my mother because she was such an angry person, and she was very difficult to love in some ways. But once I started writing the family legacy and these different things, I mean, she was married, she was raped as a 13-year-old and had to get married
Hmm.
because she got pregnant, and just had a hellish life. And so that resentment I had felt toward her just melted away, and I felt nothing but compassion. So I would say the writing of the trauma part, I was ready to do it. And I think maybe 20 years ago, right after it happened, I really wasn't ready to do it. But at in my 50s, I was ready.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's, that's been my experience as well, as far as writing about traumatic things. And one thing I noticed, and I'm curious about this for you, is there's a real thing with where we come from, the religiosity and the limitations with your parents and your in the environment and everything that you were living in, the lack of education. I mean,
Yeah.
I experienced a lot of that as well. And so there's a process of, don't you think, of finding language?
Mm-hmm.
It's like putting words to it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I was curious if that was the case for you, if it was hard to find the words, or if that was part of the process of getting to the point where you were ready. You're finally, for me, it's like finally something comes through because I've I found language
Yeah.
that I didn't have before.
That
I
makes
don't know.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when I was ready, it's like that prologue was probably written one day in a poetry class. And it was all very clear to me and very visceral. And it probably came from the class teacher just saying, put yourself back in that environment. What did it smell like? What did you hear going into the sensorial experience? And then it's like the words just flowed.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like it just sort of almost channels.
Very much.
Yeah, and I'm curious about that too. It's like you can access those scenes.
hmm
For me, sometimes it's like they're like a movie.
hmm
It's like you see a movie and then you write down as you see it. Well, that's kind of how I experienced some of the
hmm
scenes in your book. Was
hmm
very cinematic in the sense of of really putting me in the scene. So, I can see all the people who joined, but I can't see any comments.
I'm not sure how to
Okay,
do
so
that.
let's
Yeah.
I love that you brought up the trauma with your mom and everything, because the transgenerational trauma, since we're speaking of trauma, and this is a good time to talk about how that comes out in the book and those patterns with all the child brides.
Exactly. Exactly. And a lot of this I was not really consciously aware of because it was never talked about in my family, until I got into 23andMe back in 2012, 2013, when it was a new thing. And I started looking up the birth records and the babies that were born. And oh, here's this whole branch of secret cousins that came from that early marriage that no one knew about. And then contacting people and getting more of the family history. And so, yeah, there was a history of my mother at 13 married and then three children, boom, 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 abusive alcoholic man. My grandmother was 14. And going back, I think in the lineage, there was one that had actually been 10, a couple
Mm.
grandmothers back. And I made it to 16, but I had not consciously ever put together that there's a transgenerational pattern here.
Wow. I would love to be able to trace that in my family. I was 16 too, you
Wow.
know? Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we don't see as much of that anymore, thank God. But
Yeah.
mhm,
Well, there's the combination. I think you talk about the religiosity, the mental
yeah,
health issues, and the poverty.
yeah,
And uh, gosh, the story about these women in your history, the one with all the many children, like I don't know if you want to reveal details about that. I mean, or people have to read the book to read
yeah,
it
yeah.
because yeah, um, but it's just phenomenal. Of,
Yeah,
of,
a lot of mental illness. Two of my mother's sisters, at least two, had schizophrenia and multiple pregnancies, and they were, many of them were born at home and didn't survive and were buried in the backyard, and just, just bizarre stuff that when I've written these stories in my memoir groups, people look at me and say, "But you look so normal. How could this be your family?" And it's like, well,
right.
some of us learn to look normal pretty well. So,
The title of the book is Nightbird. Once again, here, and let me show everybody the book. So we do, if we can get it in the chat for a link, that would be great. If somebody could help us out and get this in the chat, a link to purchase the book. So maybe Lee, I know Lee, hi Lee, is here. So anyway, yeah, so but the connection that I feel is like all of this is really connected because it's really not abnormal. I mean,
mhm,
it's like people are like, "Oh, you seem so well, this is not abnormal. There are
mhm.
so many women who live this life.
That's true. They just
So
don't talk
many
about it. Yeah.
we just don't talk about it. We
Yeah.
don't it's hidden. It's
Mhm.
hidden.
Mhm.
And it's just and it also brings up, so many things like autonomy and the right to control our own body and so
Mhm.
many issues that are relevant to the oppression of women and how we end up in these situations.
Yeah,
It's
very
not
much.
like we sat up at 12 years old and said, oh, I think I'm gonna, but I really related to the high school kids getting raped and having the plan for how they're going to go on welfare. That's real
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
That's real too.
Yeah. Very much.
Very there were two aunts you talked about, since we're going to get into the religion here, the religious background, and one of your aunts and the was well, not a tea reader. That was my great grandma. She was a see the commonalities. She, my great grandma was a tea leaves reader and a witch, so to speak. But Aunt Annie was she read cards.
She read
And
cards. She would do tea leaves too sometimes, but cards were her big thing. Yeah. She got 20 bucks every time she gave a reading. And she had a gig with group of soap opera stars in Hollywood. And she would drive and read their cards. And it was always about their love lives. And she was very colorful, believed in spiritism, and talking to dead
Mhm.
people and seances, and yeah, bright red hair, floral, what she called shifts in the 60s, and she always drove a blue Mustang, so she was quite a character.
Yeah, I loved her. And then she is in contrast to Aunt Jane.
Yes. Yes,
So
who
tell
was
us,
the Bible woman, straight backed, conservative. She never smiled much, but didn't have much emotion. She was very obsessive about religion. And she was really, I think, the primary brainwasher for me because I spent so much time with her as a child. And just this whole thing about you live every day for God and it will all work out. You don't have to plan your future. You just quote the Bible, immerse yourself in church, and don't feel your feelings. And she had, again, a very tragic end to her life. Both of them, life ended tragically for
Mhm.
them, but very different personalities, where Annie was big and colorful and Jane was very rigid and constrained and obsessive.
Yeah, and she reminded me, Aunt Jane reminded me of the women in the two by two uh,
Yes.
sect that I was raised in, very, very much. Somewhat of my mother, although my mother did laugh and smile. So she had she had a more charming side to her that could come out, but this seriousness, this
Yes.
rigidity, this
Yes.
obsessive compulsive uh focus on, the religiosity
Mm-hmm.
and I really related to how you described how Aunt Jane kept her house.
Mm-hmm.
And she had this orderly house and you had lunch and everything was on. And that's something that my mom provided, that I believe, because she grew up in a alcoholic home, which we never, of course, secrets. We never
Mm-hmm.
learned about that until she was 60 or something.
Mm-hmm.
But, so she came from chaos and she created all this order. So I'd love to hear about how religion in these churches and Aunt Jane and your mom dropped you off at Sunday school when you were
Mm-hmm.
4, how this all contributed to, I mean, because I think you survived that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What was that, a function of survival? Because you could latch on to these
Yeah.
beliefs or whatever.
Yeah, it was very much survival for me, although it induced a tremendous amount of anxiety because there was so much of a focus on the devil all the time. And I remember laying awake at night and trying to pray for every possible person I could think of, and all the animals and all the pets, because if you don't say somebody's name specifically, they something terrible could happen. And this sense of it's all on my shoulders and I'm responsible, and just this incredible burden, for being a child with these obsessive tendencies, which I still think I'm kind of wired for obsessive tendencies because of all that. And so there was a lot of fear, a lot of shame and guilt. And, Jesus was crucified because of my sin. And I took that on and believed it. And, I think that set me up for a lifetime of self-esteem struggles, with feeling like I don't deserve good things. Self-sacrifice is a virtue. Who's meant to enjoy
Mhm.
life? You are here to serve in all things. And so a lot of those early lessons are things that have been the subject of my own therapy and growth over the years, is how to let go and feel like I do deserve to enjoy life, and it's okay to have fun, and I don't have to be productive, every waking
Yeah.
moment, which is that's still a struggle for me. I have to talk to myself about that. It's okay to relax, because relaxing and that religious training, they did not go
Mhm.
together. And I even went out street witnessing and went door to door trying to lead people to Jesus, because we were told this is your job, this is your duty, you're all missionaries in your neighborhoods. And I took all that very seriously.
Yeah, so did I. I used to lay in bed away and cry for the neighbors because they were
Yeah.
going to hell. And it's like
Yeah,
they didn't know
exactly.
the truth and they were going to
Exactly.
I mean, I smile now. I mean, I'm glad we can laugh at ourselves. If we couldn't laugh
Yeah.
at ourselves,
Yeah.
we would cry. We
Yeah.
can find the humor in it, but it's also heartbreaking because don't you think that that kind of indoctrination, which you were indoctrinated, clearly.
Hmm.
You were
Hmm.
indoctrinated basically in 3 different churches and by your aunt.
Hmm.
And it was the only way that you could really please your mother was,
Right. Because
to memorize scriptures.
yeah, my mother really wanted moral children. And I think she was very much a believer, but she didn't attend church because my father, I think he was jealous and he didn't want her attending church. But she made sure that I was attending church all the time. And I think she had a tremendous fear that I would become sexually active and get pregnant, as she had. And so
Right.
church was going to take care of all that, which in truth, I met him at church, right? That's where I met the 10-year older man that I, at 15, that I hooked up with. That
Mm.
was at church. So that didn't protect me, Mom. I'm sorry, but
No, I mean, as a young mother who had a child at 16, that's one of the fears that we have for our children.
Yeah.
And it seems like we that comes out in a variety of ways. And I'll just share, some wisdom about that in hindsight is that by trying to prevent that, I create it
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
by trying to because of my fear, you know.
Exactly.
And it just keeps that's transgenerational
Mm-hmm.
transmission of
Mm-hmm.
trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it just goes on down the
Yeah.
line. Um, how did how did this religious conditioning impact your sense? Well, you've talked about it a little bit. It really affected your self-esteem, your sense
Yeah.
of self.
Yeah.
And the other thing I noticed is there's a place in the book somewhere where you say it has to do with choice. And there's a really great line. I thought I had a note here. I'm looking for it. But the really key thing for me in having this kind of indoctrination is that there is no choice.
No. No.
There is no choice.
No, you lose any sense of agency that you have any power over yourself or your life or what happens. So I'm 15, I meet a 25-year-old guy who says, let's get married and have kids, and this is what God wants. Okay, I guess this is what God wants. So yeah, no sense of, gee, maybe there are some other options for me.
It took me a really, really long time to find agency. How about you?
A long time. I started,
Mhm.
I found a good therapist when I was 23, and I talk a bit about her in the book because she was the first one to use the word choice, that I had a choice whether I wanted to go to college, whether I wanted to continue to be a religious stay at home mother who was so depressed she could barely get out of bed because that life was not fitting for me anymore, that I could continue to be married to this man who treated me like a child, and who was, quite
Mhm.
frankly, on the schizophrenic spectrum and heard God's voice all the time, and just, he was mentally ill. So she convinced me that I had a choice, which I did, but I did not see that I had choices. And that's one of the lines I think that I use in the book is choice was the scariest word anyone had ever said to me because I had a hard
Yeah.
time wrapping my head around it. But once I started, that sense of agency started, it grew. And
Yeah.
again, at this point, every day I see I have so many choices, and where I focus, what I put my energy into, what I believe, the people I choose to be with. And it's just, to me, that sense of agency, if we had to encapsulate what is mental health, I think it's that.
Wow. I love that. I love that. I think that's 100%. If I could bottle agency and we could drive around the country in a bus and hand it out to all the women,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, the
Yeah.
whole world would change.
Yeah.
And we are purposely kept from that in many, many ways in
Yeah.
this, patriarchy that we live
Yeah.
in. So, can you talk a little bit about the impact of that rigid religiosity on mental health and trauma vulnerability? So, to me, it's like it's such a key thing in how you ended up where you ended up with this psychopathic, sociopathic person who, of
Mhm.
course, you couldn't see that he was
No.
sociopathic because you were a believer. You were a
Mhm.
believer by that time, you were a believer in therapy and
Yep.
psychotherapy, and that everybody is good and
Everybody can be
can
fixed. Everybody can
everybody.
be fixed. Just get them in the door with a therapist and they'll come out transformed. Yeah. I was
Yeah, so
very naive.
I could really relate to that because of the religiosity and the
Yes.
indoctrination. So can you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I went from putting all my faith in the magical father in the sky who would just, if I prayed enough, that it would all happen, and life taught me that that wasn't true. People still died despite my prayer, my mother and other people in my life. And I then was fascinated with psychology and put my faith in that, and became, I would say, irrational. Although I will say grad school kind of did teach us. at least back in the
Mhm.
80s when I was in grad school, that everything was related to people's trauma and everybody could be transformed if they would just do therapy. And so, with my
Yep.
second husband, who was the psychopathic one, the one that committed suicide, so the book is sort of that's the fulcrum of the story. I really believed that I held on to hope for years. I was with him for 17 years before I told him that I wanted a divorce, and that was the day he killed himself. So I was very self sacrificing, very compassionate toward him. I made excuses for him. I decided it must be ADHD, these rage episodes and these abusive, terrible things he would do. Maybe he's bipolar. Maybe there's a medication that would fix it. And being so programmed to think the best of people and to always have hope and to think that this belief system is going to be transformative, it kept me hooked for a long time. And I really did live in a way that allowed me to tolerate a lot of abusive behavior that I should never have tolerated.
That really connected some dots for me because I could really relate to that, having been come from the extreme indoctrination, which, really thwarts our development, in
Hmm.
so many ways. And then it's almost like we're groomed to be targets.
Hmm. Very much. Very much. When I
And
used to work in the women's shelter program, I was the director of counseling in a domestic violence program. And so many women that came in that had been terribly abused were from fundamentalist families and were very similar. And so I saw a lot of myself in them as well.
yeah, and it's impossible when you're in that situation and you've been groomed and indoctrinated like that. It's very, very difficult to see or have any awareness because this is what you know.
And you're used to blaming yourself
Yeah.
and feeling guilt and shame. And so if a partner is yelling at you and screaming that you're the reason I have to let off steam like this, okay, I guess I shouldn't have complained about the volume of the stereo because now you broke it and you had a fit and you threw things around the house and you put your fist through the wall, and I should have just been quiet. And so you learn to walk on eggshells. And people who are abusive in their personality structure, they will exploit that because they learn that quickly that they can control you with a rage outburst and telling you it's your fault that I do these things. So we're very much set up for that by religion.
We are, and it it it, it's dangerous and destructive and sets us up for harm
Yeah.
and so much, and there's so much control that's going on. And yet, I think there are, I mean, your second husband, was on the extreme end of the spectrum as far as his, personality, cluster B,
Yeah.
disorder. That's another commonality we have. I'm an LCSW. So we both got into the mental health field and
Exactly.
psychology.
Yeah.
And of course we did. I mean, I felt the same way as you. Like it became my new religion, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I've even written about how recovery became my new religion,
mhm.
and how to skin a gorilla, and recognizing that I carried these patterns and these beliefs with me, and so then wherever I go, I'm imposing and projecting them onto my surroundings, not knowing that they're coming from my conditioning,
Right. Right.
and not knowing that they're projected, and
Mhm.
not it's like a cage. Don't
Mhm.
it's like a prison in your mind is made into a cage and a prison, and it's a very, very effective way to oppress women. But
Very.
I guess what I'm trying to get to here is that there are a lot of men who are conditioned for those patterns of harmfulness. They're entitled.
Entitled.
They are
Yeah.
conditioned the opposite way, to be entitled and to have all of these beliefs
Mhm.
that, it is your fault.
Mhm.
It is
Mhm.
their partner's fault. Everything is
Mhm.
their partner's fault because they can't possibly be wrong because they're basically, next to God,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. They're second in line, they're the head of the household, and, they're so they're conditioned as well.
Yeah. Very
And
much.
it's
And
not just yeah.
Low on empathy, just really low on empathy. And I've said for a long time, if we could take half of our empathy and give it to the guys like that, maybe we would all even out a bit. But
So on our tour, we need to bottle empathy and we need to bottle agency. And
agency,
we'll
yep,
give all the guys the empathy and we'll hand out the agency. But
perfect.
so yeah. So I don't know. I just think there's so much that could be said about how this indoctrination and religious conditioning uh, plays into this.
Yeah,
You
it
know,
really
which is
really does set, I think, particularly for women, sets us up to be victims in abusive relationships.
yeah. So that's why, you know, there's nothing wrong with you and there never was versus original sin
Yeah,
is
I
my,
love that.
yeah, it's such a great liberation from all of that. None of
Yeah,
it's true.
yeah,
There is nothing wrong with you and there never was.
right.
And here's some agency
Here's some
and let's
agency.
kick ass.
Yeah,
And Siobhan's book is going to help you do that. Let me share it again. Nightbird, a memoir. So hopefully we have a link to it in the comments. But I guess now we need to get into this revenge suicide as coercive violence because
yeah.
we need to connect those dots for people because
People
I've
don't
never really
understand it.
heard that.
Yeah, people don't understand it. And what I saw over the years were patterns with suicide, working with so many. It's always been victims of domestic violence have been a specialty for me. And I did run a program through a women's shelter, as I mentioned. And I saw a pattern with the men, and I mentioned several of these cases, but believe me, I've seen more, who would shoot themselves in the head or in the face or in the jaw,
Mhm.
and sometimes miss the brain and then live without the complete face, right? But I would see these horror stories through my work, and they would often do it when the woman was trying to leave the relationship. And this would be like, here's my final
Yep.
revenge at you. And so I took a deep dive into suicide after my husband's death and found a person from Harvard. I wish I could find all her research right now, but about 50% of people who suicide successfully are very depressed. And so we think that everybody who suicides is depressed. But if you take the other 50%, you can break it down, and a certain percentage of them are rational. They have a terminal illness or they're in chronic pain, they're tired of it, and they want to move on. And so that's a different scenario than the person who's just disabled with major depressive disorder. Then you have another group of people who are psychotic. And so they're hallucinating, they're having delusions, they don't know what they're doing. And, you know, a classic
Mhm.
example would be the person thinks they're going to fly, so they jump out the window and they die. If they were not psychotic, they would not have done that. And so that's another very different category that's unfortunately poorly understood because so many people don't understand psychosis. And then the final category is the revenge suicide. And that is done in the context of a relationship where there's been domestic abuse. And it's nearly always in the middle of a fight or an altercation or a custody dispute where the woman is trying to exit the relationship. And unfortunately, it's more common than people realize. And I think a lot of clinicians don't understand that very well. But that was certainly the case in my situation because he hanged himself on the day I told him I was finally completely ready to get a divorce because I was tired with living with his volatility and psychopathic behavior. And I believe the way he staged it, those kind of suicides are usually staged. And there was a light shining on his body, and he left this big poster up on the door for me to see, telling me where to find him. And it was really the final, as I say, live with this now. Let this be burned into your retinas, woman, because you will never get over this. And so it's about domination, control, rage, and revenge. And this is another category. When we look at the murder suicides, which I think that will jump out to people because they're so horrendous when they happen. Sometimes this will be a guy that kills the kids, he kills the wife, then he kills himself. And I was involved as a clinician in one of those cases. I came in after the fact to debrief law enforcement who had to walk in on this horrendous scene that happened in California.
Mhm.
It's on a continuum of domestic violence, and it's sort of like this is the final awful outcome. And if a man does not have access to a firearm, they typically do it by hanging. And so that was pointed out to me by the therapist that I worked with, who was really helpful after this event, is that this was an act of aggression and rage and revenge for trying to break the tie with him. He would not allow me to ever break the tie.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we do hear about the murder suicides, and
Hmm.
we kind of make that connection, but
Hmm.
just the revenge suicide,
Yeah.
I personally had not made
Yeah.
that known or heard of it or made the connection, you
Yeah, it
know?
hasn't been discussed as much, but it's interesting how often I've run into it. There was a case here in Oregon when I was running a suicide survivors group where a woman came in and her soon to be ex husband that she was divorcing drove, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, drove 50 miles in the middle of the night with a shotgun, rang her doorbell,
Mhm.
and when she answered the door, he shot himself in the face right in front of her. And that was pure aggression. So it's just a different spin than the person who overdoses or shoots themselves because they're just in this terrible major depression and they can't see another way out of it.
Yeah, there's a real connection, with the aggression and the violence, and a very distinct differentiation between
Hmm.
the other kinds of
Exactly.
suicide,
And
like you
when
just went through, yeah.
when it first happened, I didn't understand it, and I remember saying to the police officer who showed me this big poster he had written, I said, "This feels mean." And the detective said, "Yeah, this was mean. This was about you, not just about him." And I think that's the thing that some of the clinicians, because I went to a few therapists after this, and some of them they didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to make sense of it. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know how to help me. And when I found one who was really a specialist in suicide, and he had had quite a few in his family lineage, which was why he was so passionately interested in understanding it, he said, "No, you have to look at this on the continuum of domestic abuse."
Yeah,
So then the light bulb started coming on for me, and I started being able to see the patterns with his behavior, and really using the word abuse because I had tried not to use it. In recent, the more near the end of the marriage, I was saying you're behaving abusively. But because he didn't use a fist, he did lots of other things. He put fists through walls. He would grab me by the clothes and throw me around while screaming. He would scare the hell out of me. But I still, because he didn't hit, I minimized it for years
right,
and
right.
didn't use the word abuse.
I know for me, I mean, I also have experienced domestic violence. I mean, there was an essay I wrote about it that I think you may have read, but and that we may have connected in the beginning with that, but I had no to me, if they didn't hit you, that then you weren't it wasn't
Right,
domestic violence.
right.
I didn't connect because of where where I came from and my,
Hmm.
you know, it just didn't connect because I couldn't understand emotional abuse.
Hmm.
I couldn't understand verbal abuse or psychological abuse. I
Yeah,
just understood physical violence, and that's what I thought of it as. And
yeah,
so that also keeps you in a situation longer than you need to be,
definitely,
for
definitely.
sure, because
And
you don't even recognize it.
I'm so
Yeah.
sensitive to it now. And I say at the end of the book in the epilogue that, I've married a man who never raises his voice. And that is the truth. He doesn't. And I'm just extremely sensitive to anybody yelling at me or, doing anything aggressive like that. It's like I do not tolerate it because I did live with it for 17 long
Yeah.
years.
I'm the same way. It's like, nope, nope, nobody, nope. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's some agency there as well. But
Hmm.
yeah, I think there is a lack. I mean, I'm really glad that you pulled the covers back on this in so many different ways in your talks and your work, beyond beyond the memoir, which is just really powerful and important. But I think there is a dearth in that we have much further to go in understanding domestic violence. We
Yes.
have It's much deeper, and a lot of and the attitudes that we have about gender and
Hmm.
gender roles and uh, the place of a woman and the place of a man and so on and so forth. um, all of this is what creates the problem to begin with.
Hmm.
So, and the religiosity is just another whole new level of it. And I don't think that I'm trying to think of the name of this guy who wrote a book about domestic violence. Um, it reminds me of the way that you were thinking about, well, he's going to get help because he kept going to therapy,
Right.
and you're thinking, well, he'll get therapy and that will change him, that will help him. The problem is the therapists that he's going to don't even recognize.
And he certainly didn't go in. He was, in the very psychopathic way. He was wildly entertaining. He knew how to manipulate people. He knew how to get them to like him, and he entertained his therapists. Occasionally I would go in with him and try to, give a heads up
Mhm.
that there's more wrong here, but he was telling jokes. He had them laughing. He was an extremely charming, funny, witty, intelligent man, and they never knew about his temper and about his episodes. And, if they don't know, and a person like that isn't going to tell them, um, there's no treatment that's going to help. And he never got treatment for his abusive personality. He would
Yeah,
have denied that he had an abusive personality. He had no problems. It was like,
right.
just don't piss me off and everything will be fine. Right. So,
Exactly. So, I mean, these men truly believe that they're entitled and they truly believe that you need to change your behavior.
right. Don't
You
complain. Hmm.
you have a problem. They're extremely critical.
And it's
Um,
it's one of the interesting things. I'm really into Robert Sapolsky, right, the neuroscientist, and I post so much about him. But he also was a primatologist in addition to studying humans, and he talks in one of his books quite a bit, and it just connected the dots again for me. Primates, certain kinds of monkeys, gorillas, they have displacement aggression where they'll find a weak person in the group and they will pick on them and do things to them. And then they go on about
oh,
their day and they feel better. They just feel better. And it's called displacement aggression. And I see that with this kind of abusive personality. It's like, who can I get away with this? And it's often the wife or the partner. And it just becomes this way. I had a rough day at work. I come home rather than kick the dog, which he did kick the dog on one occasion, which was horrendous. But it's like, you become the verbal punching bag just because they've got this tension and it feels better once they displace it.
exactly. And this brings to mind, on May 6th, I'll be talking with Rebecca C. Mandeville, who's a scapegoat expert and wrote a book where she kind of coined the term family scapegoat abuse, which is a form of domestic violence.
Yeah.
And this displacement aggression is ringing a bell as far as the scapegoating dynamics that go on in
Hmm.
families. It's systemic, and of course it's way
Yeah.
beyond families. It's systemic in our entire society, evolution, and so on. So but that is an interesting thing. I want to make note of that so we can look into that and see how that connects maybe
Yeah.
with scapegoat abuse. And I know there's people here who are watching who are on Rebecca's Substack and are scapegoat survivors. And this is
Yeah.
domestic violence. This
Exactly.
is,
It
and it's not
totally.
even recognized.
Yeah, totally. I When I saw that in the neuroscience book, I was like, that's exactly it. Yeah, and you see it in the primate family, this displacement aggression. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that term, displacement aggression.
Hmm.
Um, Something I wanted to ask about is, and hear from you about is What do people misunderstand about psychopathy?
They think that it's always caused by trauma, and it's actually not. And there's really good research on that. I can direct you to that if people want to know more. It's looked at now as a neurobiological difference, and the person is just not born with the wiring to have normal empathy. And so it's developmentally they're very different from the rest of us who have the empathy circuitry in our brain. They don't have it. And you combine that with a culture that rewards psychopathy, and you end up with people like the ones that are running our government right now. And it's been a myth in the culture that everybody who's a bully and victimizes other people and who becomes a predator, that they're all these poor abused people, that they had rough childhoods. Occasionally you do find that, but that's not the bulk of them. And I don't think that people understand that. I bought into that with my late husband, because he was a psychology major. He had a degree in psychology, and
Yep.
he could always talk about how I had it so hard as a kid. That was part of his manipulative routine, because as a therapist, I would buy into that and think, oh, poor baby, give him a pass. He had a mean mother, and so he can't help it that he's hurting other people, that he's putting fists through walls and breaking things in the house. And that was a terrible error of judgment and misunderstanding of it all. So,
Yeah, I just think that's so important for people to understand because, you know, the other thing I think you said in the book is that when there's trauma, some expert said to you, I think it was that same guy, that same therapist that helped you. He said that you blame yourself,
always blame yourself. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you always blame yourself when there's
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah, if you
Um,
sit in a room with suicide survivors, which I have done quite a bit, as a client and as a clinician, right? Both roles. You will have people go around and share, what brings you here or whatever. And everybody in the group will say, I could have prevented it if I had just whatever. And it's so universal that when somebody does that, we blame ourselves. And then if
yeah,
you have that religious upbringing that you're supposed to be able to fix everything, and if you just pray hard enough, or you just get them to therapy, or you just sacrifice enough, you could have prevented this. And that's a terrible cognitive distortion that, we don't have power over other people like that. We just don't. And so that was really important for me to hear in therapy, is that I didn't cause his problems. I didn't control his problems. If I could have, I would have. I couldn't. And I certainly couldn't cure him. And
right.
so that really coming to a place of understanding that and gaining insight really helped me move on from it.
Yeah, and I think that's a function of agency too.
Hmm.
And there's a process of, as we grow and evolve out of and recover from these things to get to that place of wholeness and that awareness of this innate wholeness that we have that
Hmm.
was stolen from us, and we were taught and conditioned to believe that we were something else. And so for me, the real turning point for me at one point was when I experienced a betrayal,
Hmm.
and I knew that it had nothing to do with me,
Hmm.
nothing to do
Hmm.
with me.
Hmm.
And that was a beautiful moment because
That's
I
what,
didn't take it on. I
yeah,
didn't internalize it. I knew this was this person's issue. I mean, this was a significant betrayal. And I knew it was a function of their evolution and their own problems.
yeah.
And it was completely not connected to me. And I did not take that on. And it was a very powerful moment in my life,
That's
you know,
incredible. Yeah.
isn't it?
That's the gift we want everybody to have, is this sense that, what other people, their choices, whether they're wonderful choices or they're horrible choices, it's like we can't control it and it doesn't have anything to do with us.
Right. It does not. And the problem with that, there's another thing back to the clinical issue is that people go to these marriage counselors. I mean, I shouldn't say these marriage counselors.
You can. Yeah.
And end up, having to work on issues where they're being abused.
100%. And we tried that. I was always trying to get him in therapy, which was ridiculous because he was never honest. Therefore, it was a waste of time and money and a waste of the therapist's time. But I was trying to get couples counseling, and it's like, communication skills. It's like he was a wonderful communicator. He could communicate better than anyone. Problem was, none of it was true. He was just there
Right.
to manipulate and control the story, and to
Yeah.
always make himself, as isn't he the great guy here? And couples counselors very often don't get that piece of it. I stopped doing couples counseling a few years ago because I couldn't restrain myself from wanting to put my hand up and say, let me tell you what's going on here. What I would do is I would say, okay, Fred and June, okay, Fred, I'm hearing you say that you are happy with yourself just as you are. And Fred would say yes. And then
Yeah.
June, I'm hearing you say that you're not happy with Fred the way he is. And she would say yes. Fred, what do you think the solution is? June just needs to quit complaining. Okay,
Right.
June, are you hearing what Fred is saying? Fred is not going to change. Fred does not want to change. He just wants you to not complain, because all these couple communication techniques, that's not going to change this core thing that's happening. And
It's
so,
not.
and
No, it
so
is not.
I just got tired because, of course, June's agenda was make him change. Fred's agenda is make her quit complaining about me. And it's like, there's enough people with anxiety, depression, and PTSD I can treat. I don't need to play that game anymore. Wore me out.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. I'm with you on that, sister. Okay. So I think what we can do now, I want to, well, I want to move into asking the people in the chat to ask their questions. And if I skipped your question, please go ahead and put it back in the chat again. And I wanted to bring in a question that somebody did ask in advance. Jane Clark, story carrier. And she wanted to know, how did you feel when Nightbird was finally published? Were you relieved, panicked, something else?
I was probably relieved, because until you see your book, having written a few other ones, it's like until you can pick it up and hold it, it's not real. And I felt like my big goal with it is hoping it would open these kind of conversations and do some good in the world. And it was also kind of a relief that all the years I spent writing all that memoir stuff, it's like, this hopefully will do some good. So it was a good feeling. And I was really, my biggest concern is that people would say, oh, this book was so dark and unpleasant. But that's not the book I wanted to write. And I really wanted to write about my process of healing and growing. And as you would say, becoming whole. And I have a wonderful life. I'm grateful every day for it. And there was a time, the 6 months after his death were rough, particularly the first 3 months were rough. And I didn't know that I was going to be able to eat. I lost so much weight. I was just a mess. And with the love of friends, those heart to heart connections, good people, good therapy, and medication. I had to take medication, raise my hand on that, no shame. I was able to go back to work, and I've had a good career and married a gentleman, a kind man that does empathy really well. My kids are
Yeah.
grown, they're fine, and I'm just so grateful for my life. And that's the message I hope people take away.
Thank you, because I'm so glad that you came through to the other side so you could bring this to us.
Well,
It's
thank you.
really, really meaningful. Um, I know there was a question earlier I saw from, and please put questions or comments in the chat so I can share them with Siobhan, or she can read them herself. But there was a question from Lee Bear about and I thought this was a great question, because I know it does apply in my case as well. She wanted to know how your background as a psychotherapist helped and informed your ability to write the memoir.
It definitely gave me, as we talked about getting language, it
Yeah.
definitely gave me the sense of how to explain this, and working with other women and witnessing the other struggles and the similarities in the thinking and in the backgrounds and people with religious backgrounds. I started to get the words, and being a clinician, when I can pull in the neuroscience part and talk about displacement aggression, it's like, oh, that's another connect the dots
Yeah.
moment. So it definitely helped me and continues to help me, because I think therapists learn from their clients, it goes both ways.
Mhm.
Hopefully we're sharing helpful information with them, but just by witnessing other people's struggles, we see what works and what helps people grow, and that helps us at the same time.
And it all kind of comes together like you had this parallel of your personal and professional life that as you grew, you got into, I think you were 23 when you went to school and got your psychology degree, and then you went to graduate school. So that was sort of a major part of your path
Yeah.
was your yeah,
I was always trying to figure life out. I knew I came from a very dysfunctional family, and I didn't want to replicate that. I didn't want my kids to go through the things I went through as a kid. And once I flushed the religious training and got into therapy, I became fascinated with psychology. And, I've still got that missionary streak. I want to make the world a better
yeah,
place, but I hope I have a better sense on what I can and can't do now. But certainly sharing my own story is something I can do, and I hope that that's a bridge for people.
yeah. Kate wants to know, did you feel any sort of existential relief when your primary abuser passed on?
That's a wonderful question. And on a certain level, I did. I was tormented. Early in the book, I talk about going around saying, "I killed him. I killed him. I killed him," by asking for a divorce. I caused his death. That was hell. But that just tapped it back into my guilt and shame, that I carried from childhood. But I think the idea of not living with him was a huge relief, and not living with the anxiety of having to walk on eggshells, and the sense that I could build my own life. I think that was a relief. And even now, if that was his choice to go out that way, I think it was a very cruel thing that he did. And I don't people talk about complicated grief, and there's no one way to do grief. I can't say I feel grief for his choice. I mean, I can say I'm sorry he did it that way, but that was his choice. And my main grief is that I spent 17 years with him. I think I have grief over that. I regret that intensely.
Yeah. There is, you said somewhere in the book, the decisions I made at 15 would haunt me the rest of my life.
Hmm. Hmm.
I can relate to that.
Hmm.
But how could we have chosen we didn't have a choice.
We
We
didn't.
didn't have a
No,
choice.
no.
There was no
And,
choice. Yeah.
and considering the transgenerational patterns, we
Yeah.
have done pretty well. You and
And
I
we
both, we've
have.
got good lives. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then to come into this, completion that you have in this place of completion, Siobhan, where you really can be helpful to others in a really meaningful way. I mean, there's a really good feeling in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
finally come to that. I mean, it is a place of power, and maybe it's part of the stage of life that we've come to. I mean,
Yeah.
but it's not definitely hooked to chronological age, but
Hmm. Hmm.
it just feels sometimes like it took too long,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
That was my
it's a
thinking.
really good place to be.
And that was my thinking with writing the book, and agreeing to write it, was that, you know, I'm old enough at this point. I've given up shame about it. Because for a time right after it happened, I was ashamed to let anybody know I had a husband that suicided. That just felt shaming. But I'm beyond shame. I don't think I have shame about anything. I have regret about choices I made and spending time with him and all those years. So I have regret, but I don't have shame. And I think honesty is what's healing. in the world, we all need to be honest. I mean, the more we can be honest and share what our struggles are, everybody's got secret struggles. One of the murder suicides down in California, where the guy killed his child, his wife, and then himself. He was a psychiatrist. And I shared clients with him and knew him to
Wow.
be a very compassionate person. Obviously, I don't know what was behind closed doors. I don't know what his wife was living with. But, you know, seeing these cases, I think there's a lot more severe pathology and these personality problems going on than people are comfortable talking about or owning. And so I hope that by writing the book that it does some good.
Great. People, please put any questions or that you might have in the thing. I'm just going to bring in one more thing, and then we'll probably close down if there's no more questions. But and that is, there's a line, and I thought I wrote it down somewhere, but it had to do with your past doesn't have to define the future.
Hmm. That's
And
that's that's my tagline. That's my tagline.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think people hear about my past and feel like I'm going to be a really impaired person and I'm not ever going to have a
Hmm.
quality of life that's, you know, and I have such a good life. And, you know, we don't have a lot of money. Therapists, as you well know, we don't get rich. And,
Right.
um, you know, I don't travel the world. I see all these people on Facebook traveling all over the world. I go, that must be nice, you know?
Hmm.
But I love my life, and you can always go in a different direction, and that doesn't mean we do it on our own. I mean, I'll be the first to say friends have stepped up, friends have been there for me. I've had good therapists. I had to look for them, but I did find good people. I found resources, and I think it's that sense of agency that allows you to do
Hmm.
that, to not let your past define you.
Yeah, that's so important, as far as, recognizing that there's narratives, there's stories, and everybody has one. And then to wake up and go, wow, this is the story they made of me. But
Yes.
what's my story?
Yes.
And I get to define that. And I get to determine that. And it's only until when I become aware of that, that I begin to revise that story because it's really not who I am, but it's a
Right.
story that was made of me based on all of these conditions
Yeah.
that I certainly did not choose, you know?
Yeah.
And so all of us can become aware, what is that story that was made of me and is being made of me right now, maybe in my domestic situation where I am. And what is my story, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
What is my
And
story?
choosing a
Yeah.
different ending. Who do I want to be? And I think that's so many of us that we have our chosen families because our biological families, they're not good people or they're not connected to our hearts. They don't care about us. And my parents died very when I was very young, and so I've always had to choose who are my chosen parents, you know, who are the older people, and I've got them in my life, older people that are like my family. Who are my chosen siblings, you know? And I think that's another way of taking agency and recreating ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and what you touched on, and Megan has a question that I want to bring out that touches on this is, the shame. When you say, my past doesn't define my future. Well, there's a lot of shame that I think shame is very, very instrumental in what keeps us trapped.
Yes.
And it's a shame when you begin to untangle what your story is from the story that was made of you. You begin to differentiate between the shame that doesn't belong to you. This
Right.
is not your shame. This
Right.
does not belong to you. And you can give it back to them. So
Mhm.
Megan says, do you have advice for someone sharing their story that is continually silenced and shamed by others on how to cope with that on others? So maybe I'm not healed enough to tolerate it. Well, or something like that. She's saying,
I would just
yeah.
find a new peer group to share with. right? I mean, if you're feeling like people shame you when you share, those are not your
Yeah,
people.
100% agree.
I've had people say that to me when I had to take psychotropic medication to function and to be okay after that suicide. My gosh, I needed it. And there were people I knew who were not going to be supportive of that. And so those are just not the people I hang out with. I can think of a couple people who said something, why do you need that? You know, you don't need that. And it's like, I'm sorry, trust my judgment here. I do.
Yeah,
And so if people are going to be critical, they're not your people.
yeah. Okay, I think we're winding down, and we've touched on a lot. Um, there's so many commonalities we could go on and on. My dad was a Teamster too.
Oh, I love it. Yep. Yep. My dad
Oh,
was a Teamster. Mom got her GED at 23 and became a phlebotomist.
yeah,
So,
a GE, yeah. So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, in our
so-
family, college was not a thing, and just graduating high school, and I was always taught that the GED was a backup if you needed it. So I
yeah,
did not think I was college material, and that was another function of the family. It
yeah.
wasn't
I
done.
I thought I was my future was to be in the truth and in the cult, and so that was certainly not to go to college.
No, no, that's scary because,
I was actually supposed to be a preacher. When they have
yeah,
sister workers, so that was, because I had good insight into the Bible. I was, spinning these
yeah,
incredible insights, and I'm sure you were too. Like you were going to door to
yeah.
explain things to people. It's so hilarious. So,
You and I
but
should have
anyway,
met at
you guys,
14.
everybody, thank you so much for coming. I mean, look how many people came. Be sure and go. And follow Shavaun at Spotlight on Psychology
I'll
on
have to write.
Substack.
I haven't been writing lately. It's been about a
You
year, so I'll have to start writing again.
Yeah, we need you to start writing on Substack because this is the place to be. And that would be phenomenal to have you writing on Substack. And then and subscribe to me, please. And I need to plug my next live stream video, which is going to be May 6th with Rebecca C. Mandeville, who is a scapegoat expert, an LMFT, and wrote a book called Blamed, Shamed, and Rejected. And it's hope and healing for victims of family scapegoat abuse. And so I'm going to be interviewing her about her book and her work. And it'll kind of be a continuation of this conversation. So I hope everybody comes and joins us. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
And
Kelly. Thank you for the
yeah,
conversation.
you bet.